Hello and welcome to an exciting new episode of Google Developers Live. My name is Arun Nagarajan.
That's my name too. No, actually, I'm Dan Lazen. I'm the tech writer here, and my job is to make Arun's life difficult.
Yeah, and in fact, he's going to be very involved with some of the stuff we talk about today. Today, we're going to be talking about, it's a crash course, which is all about diving deep into a topic, an exciting topic. And today's topic, it may be a little cryptic for some of you, and I did notice a lot of you +1'd it and really were excited about it, and some of you probably were not clear. It's called AppScript Import Export. We're going to be talking about ways to get at your source code from outside of AppScript using the Drive API, the Drive SDK.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are going to find this really useful. When we were at Google I/O just a few weeks ago, had a lot of developers come up and say they really love the power of AppScript, but they're more comfortable working in sort of a code environment that's familiar to them, their own favorite editor, their own version control system.
Right.
This allows you to get access to your AppScript code and keep it in your own environment. So
yeah,
it's a big new feature.
I could totally see why developers want to run stuff in the cloud, but they may still want to write the code in their laptops and their desktops or whichever workstation that they may have. So really excited. So let's get started. Let's start taking a look at what we've done. So let's go here to my computer. And the first thing that we're going to talk about is where you can find more information about this API. Let's go here to my screen. And we'll say go to the development environment. So on the left side panel, you'll now see development environment guide section, which was available before. But what we've done is we've added a new section, and you wouldn't have seen this unless you refreshed just now. It's importing and exporting projects. And it's a great new guide that we've added that'll talk all about the stuff we'll show you today. And the idea is that with the Drive SDK, which has been around for quite a while now, you will have APIs, the Files API specifically, that allow you to get at your source code. So you can import it, you can export it, you can do interesting analysis with it, integrate with your source control system using the tools you write, or edit it in other IDEs as well.
And the reason we're using the Drive SDK here is that, as you're of course all familiar with, your AppScript code lives in Google Drive.
Right.
It's a file, a first-class file in Google Drive, just like a Google Doc, a Google Sheet, a Google presentation, any of those kind of guys.
Yeah, and we specifically call this out not to be confused with the Drive service that's in AppScript.
Yeah.
I know the terminology may get a little confusing, but I think if you kind of pay attention to some of the things you were doing here, a lot of this will become pretty clear as to what. Really,
everything we're showing you today is about AppScript. It's not in AppScript. All the calls that Arun's going to be showing you, these are through the Drive SDK, mostly HTTP requests. So don't think this is code that you can write in AppScript. Think of it as a way to work with AppScript through the Drive SDK.
Yeah. All right, so let's talk about how all the different parts of this document right here. So the first part is sort of just letting you know that we're using the Drive SDK. So if you aren't familiar with it, it's actually a really nice API. You may find yourself using it for getting at other files, PDFs, Google Docs, etc. I think it's a pretty cool API. In this case, specifically, we're going to be very interested in the Files API. And it's a REST-based API, as Dan alluded to. The first thing to note, though, is that it does require authorization. So like a lot of Google APIs, this uses OAuth 2. And the Google Drive documentation's got really good samples to walk you through how this works. On top of that, the reason I think this is really fun to work with is they've given you a lot of good tools, like Inline API Explorer, that allows you to get started without having to know all the details of OAuth. And I think we'll kind of get that point across very soon.
Like AppScript, you can try it out just right in your browser. Make sure it's all working before you go and build your application.
Great way to, that's really true. So I think just like AppScript, where you can go to a script editor and just start testing stuff out, I think the API Explorer gives you that flexibility. Now, those of you that are familiar with AppScript, the OAuth, the key point here is that there is a new scope that we've added. It's drive.scripts. And in fact, this has been out there for, I think, a few weeks now. And some people have already noticed it, and I've seen them refer to this in Stack Overflow and other forums. And now you know what it's there for. This is to allow you to get access to your actual source in AppScript rather than just the project file. So this scope is really important. Without this scope, all you can see is the existence of a project, but you cannot actually look at the code in a project, because we think the this new scope will protect the user some further because the source may contain sensitive data and so on. So we want to make sure that the user knows that an application is doing this. So let's get started. The very first thing you may want to do with your list of projects that you may have, and if you're like us, you probably have dozens of projects. Hundreds of projects in some cases. I try to keep it a little bit more neat than Dan, I guess.
A cluttered desk is good.
I guess, yeah. So the very first thing you'll probably want to do is have an API call available that lists all your AppScript projects. So let's get started with that. How this, from a technical standpoint, what it is a HTTP GET call with a authorization header that includes your OAuth2 token. And that'll return back a really nice JSON response that lists items which represent the projects, and that'll kind of give you, and for this example, you can see that there's a mail merge project with a MIME type of this particular type, which is vendor.google-apps.script. So that's a really specific MIME type that identifies Google Apps Script. And then you can see all sorts of other things that include things like the dates that it was last viewed, really a lot of really useful metadata. And then,
to be clear, what the end user is sending is the very first of the code snippets up there. They're just sending that one line broken across here. Two line actually.
Yeah, the header. Yep.
HTTP GET request. This large block of JSON here is what they're getting back.
It's a response. Yep, I should be clear. Yeah, the request and response. You can see that the request, thankfully, because of things like REST, it's really straightforward. You just encode your request, and then you get back a really nice detailed JSON response that your application can do a lot of useful things with. And you can even see that this has things like the owners and yep, all sorts of good stuff. The important thing here is this export link, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So let's first make this simple request, which just lists our Google Apps Script projects. So to do that, what we'll do is we'll go to the Google Drive SDK reference. And as I mentioned, this is a really useful resource. If you go to developers.google.com/drive, you'll find all these things that we're talking about here. In fact, I think people that want to write things like a source control integration example or exporting and having it available in some interesting syntax highlighter, there are really, I think, there's some quick starts available in different languages that I think you'll find really valuable here.
So this files page here, how does a person get to this page?
Yep. So if you go to developers.google.com/drive, on the left-hand panel, they've got a really nice organization, much like AppScript. If you go to API reference and go to files, that's the very first API that you'll often deal with, and go to list. So it matches the verbs that you end up dealing with in the API.
Right.
So list returns multiple files back. In our case, the files are project. So the terminology, just be careful with that.
And just be clear on that terminology. When we talk about a project, we mean a single sort of entity that you save as one unit in Google Drive. The files are each of the tabs within the project. So you might have multiple code files within a single project in AppScript, or you might have a code file and an HTML file if you're serving up a web app.
Yep. Yeah. The file in Drive term is what shows up in the Drive Explorer view, where you go to drive.google.com, which happens to be a project in our world. So just the terminology is important to understand there. All right, so let's go back here. So let's make a call, and they also really nicely document all the different parameters that their API accepts. So the very first thing we'll do is we'll make a call. And you can see that they have a lot of quick start guide as far as in different languages as well. So we'll go here and we'll say we want to now get our projects. So thankfully, we have really good samples that you can just literally copy and paste. So we want to copy this guy here. And we'll say, go back to my, there it is. If I say MIME type equals to that, I do need to put quotes around. And you need to authorize it. So this is how, like I said, you need to write code to handle this, or you can just use their tools, which is really nice. And you can just check this box for Google Apps Script's behavior. All right, I'm going to authorize this. The toggle is on. I've already logged in, and so I don't need to authorize it again. And if I hit execute, what's going to happen in just a couple of seconds here is the response comes back from the API, and you can see that it's basically a get followed by the authorization header, which is exactly what we show. The user agent and all that is really optional. And then here is the list of all the different projects that I care for. So you can see that I have my web app, and then if I keep going down, I'll see the next project, which happens to be a dashboard app that I built, and so on. So it gets you the idea that this is now a functional sample request. On top of that, since the Drive SDK has a lot of really nice features, like you can say, only show me the top 5 results, or you could say, only show me where I am the owner. So a really nice simple thing you could do is say, and me in owners. It kind of sounds weird, but the API is actually, I think when you execute it, the results make a lot of sense. And me is a special keyword for the person authenticated. So that way you can write a generic filter that works for whoever's at the keyboard rather than have them type in their email address or something like that.
And the reason you'd want to add this me and owners parameter is that when you search Google Drive, it's just like going to Google Drive and typing in the search box. If you have other people who've shared files with you, Arun's sharing sample code with me all the time, I'm going to see Arun's projects in my Google Drive search results. Realistically, I don't care about this guy's code. I want to see my stuff.
That's right. So depending on your tools and use cases, those filters may make a lot of difference in what comes back. So now we have the same response back, and you can see that the HTTP request now has the additional parameters in the URL. So really straightforward. What we've done so far is only demonstrate to you that AppScript projects are accessible through the Drive SDK. All right.
Cool. Let's go over that query term just one more time, in case people missed it.
Yeah. So this is Q is the query string. Where a lot of different useful fields, features can go in. In fact, they have a really nice documentation page for that as well, somewhere up here, searching for files. You should take a look at that, and that'll talk about all the different properties you could use. And then in our case, since we're saying only give us Google AppScript projects, it's really important to specify that through the MIME type.
So just Q MIME type equals application /VND/ then the Google AppScript MIME type. And then in this optional case, we added the me and owners.
Yep.
That's all you need to fill into this Q field here after you've
zoom in a little bit more.
And then click the elect button.
Yep. Really straightforward. So that ought to give you the confidence that your projects now are accessible through an API. And in our example here, we're just using the API Explorer. But thankfully, the Drive SDK has some really good quick start code snippets that you can use to get used to calling it from the command line, or writing a web app where in Java or in PHP to grab the same thing.
Yeah.
And in our example, in fact, for the very next thing that we're going to show you, we're going to write use a simple Python app. And I'm not a Python whiz, but thankfully, because there's a lot of really good sample code for me to get started, including some companion videos, this is actually really straightforward to do.
Cool.
So what we'll do next is we'll use a simple Python command line app that, given a project ID, I should say a file ID of the Drive response, it'll fetch that project and mimic that structure in my local file system.
Cool.
Wouldn't that be great? Let's go take a look.
And that's all you're going to need to then hook up that local file to either your local code repository, maybe your GitHub repo, plug it into the code editor of your choice.
You also do all sorts of things with it.
Cool.
So let me just show you the code. So this is I used the quick start, and we're going to be sharing this with you. So we want to clean this up and make sure that it's shareable.
This Python sample isn't available on the page that we're showing you quite yet.
Yep.
We'll have it up there maybe in a couple days, and we'll update this YouTube video's description with a link to this Python app as well.
Yep, we definitely want to make this available. And this example, I started based on this quick start. So you'll see a lot of similarity in that code. And in fact, I would recommend just watching this video, just a few minutes, to get a sense for all the steps required to get to the point where I'm at, which I'm going to skip in the interest of time. But the very first thing you need to do is enable the Drive API. You need to install a couple of libraries so that the Python app can work really seamlessly. And then there's this process of getting the OAuth token established. And that's a one-time process because the library actually takes care of refreshing it and keeping it up to date. So it's actually really nice. And the process requires basically you authorizing a URL once and copying and pasting a token into a command line, and it's good to go from there. So you can actually schedule this app to run every hour, or you can run it on a keyboard shortcut, and so on.
Awesome.
And yeah, so run the sample, and that's what we're going to do. So let's go take a look at the code. So what we're going to do is I have a couple of functions. One is called download project. You can imagine what that does. And one called update project, which we'll get to in a little bit. Let's start with download project. So this is the project that I want to download. How did I get the project ID? The safest way to get the project ID is back from the API. So this ID will match the ID that you'll see here. So the 1TU, if I just copy this guy and paste this in here, they're the same exact thing. Okay? And before I run, let's actually take a look at the code. So what I have here is basically a very simple sample that is 2 files and says hello world. But this could be half a dozen files, or all the code can be in one file, really however you want to organize it. So let's go and take a look at the sample here. So what we're going to do is go into my command prompt, and I will let me just make sure the right code is initialized. So we're going to run download project when I run this code. So I'm going to say Python and say, I think it's drive files.py. I'm going to run it. And it's not going to do much. It's going to very quickly run. But then you can see that behind the scenes, this folder was created without me having to do anything. If I go in there, there's 3 files, the code.js, index.html, and something called manifest.json. I'll explain that in a second. But these are the 2 things that I really care for. And let's actually go into my Sublime editor here, and you can see that I have this code available right there.
That's awesome.
So zoom in there and zoom in there. You can see that that's the code.
So helpful to so many people.
And just the fact that I can come in here, and Sublime does a really good job of syntax highlighting, and they have some really nice macros that you can run that allow you to do auto completion to a lot of useful JavaScript syntaxes that I think sometimes are hard to type. And let's do a quick example where we actually flip this back and send it back, and then we'll review the code. So I'll just say, let's say that I want to logger.log. You can see that it's trying to help me, but it doesn't know the API that well. So I'll say, hi, Dan, and save this. And
semicolon, Arun.
You don't need it. And then I go back into my Python sample, and instead of downloading it, what I'll do is I'll actually upload that. And for this, I just need the folder name as well, because that's what's important. And I'll go back to my command prompt, and I'll say, run that same thing. And you can make this much more configurable, and that's one of the reasons we're not publishing the code right away, because it should be a command line parameter. We figured it's more important to get the documentation out to you so that you can start doing some really cool things. And I ran the code again. And now let's go take with the script editor. And we do need to reload the script editor. Unfortunately, it doesn't update live like it would for docs. But there it is. The code that I edited in my offline editor, after I ran a little tool that was pretty immediate, I'm able to see that code on my script editor, as if another person on another browser somewhere is typing in that code.
Yeah. You're your own collaborator now.
So that's really powerful. So to be able to do that, now you can start really thinking about all sorts of really cool use cases. Hopefully you're seeing that the fact that I can edit this code is really nice in Sublime, but really I think where the power comes in is if you start thinking about, okay, now I can write a little synchronization tool that just copies all my folders for backup purposes, or projects for all backup purposes, or automatically publishes to a GitHub repo every hour after checking for updates, or something along those lines. So hopefully this, and this is purely a developer feature. So this is great for all you developers that really want to use the tools that you have. If you have some AppScript code calling an App Engine code, and you're used to using a particular Eclipse setup, maybe there's some interesting things you could do here to make that all work.
Absolutely. Now, from what I understand, this is only going to work for AppScript files that are standalone in
That's
Drive.
right. That's right.
You can't
yeah.
use this to get access to a container-bound script like one that's embedded in a spreadsheet or embedded in Google Docs.
That's right. The simple rule of thumb is if you can see the script project in your Drive, those files, those projects are exportable and importable. At this point, there's no way to get at the project that's associated to a particular document or form or spreadsheet. But if you have a library that is shared, hopefully it also improves some of the reusability patterns around libraries. So that is the case today. And we look forward to hearing your feedback to see what makes sense and how we can improve this further. By way of limitations, there are a couple other limitations I would like to quickly point out as well. So in our API section, in the API guide, the very last section is called limitations. Like any good API, we want to be honest, and there are a few things that we can't do right away. But hopefully, by us explaining, this all makes sense. The very first thing, like I mentioned, container-bound scripts cannot be accessed through the API at this point. You can only get at the source code, not the project properties, and certain actions like publishing and versioning are not quite available at this point.
So you can't get your script DB as part of this, for example.
At this point, yep. Yeah. So it's only the source code that's.
But if you were using, for example, a spreadsheet as a data source, because the spreadsheet lives in Google Drive, you can actually use a variation of this technique to grab a copy of your spreadsheet.
You could do some pretty cool things like that.
You'd have to export it first, not live Google Drive.
That's the one with the crazy ideas.
Yeah. Let's not confuse people. All right, back to Arun.
All right, so let's take a look at what some of the things that happen behind the scenes are. So we showed you what can be done, a quick demo of that. We showed you some of the limitations that you have to be aware of. Now let's talk about some of the details of how this all worked out. So before I show you the Python code, let me show you the APIs that behind the scenes were exchanged. The very first thing to keep in mind is let me just come back here. Okay, cool. So I talked about how you can list your projects. Once you listed your project, one of the things that you get back that's really important is this concept for export links. Export links is actually a generic Google Drive feature. So for instance, a Google document can be exported to a PDF. That link is described within the export links for that document object in the response. So for a Google Apps Script project, the only export link is a JSON file. So that's something that you have to know about. So if you have a already existing Google Drive integration, taking advantage of some of the things that we're doing here with AppScript is actually really straightforward. So we didn't invent anything brand new there. What we did have to kind of make up here, because it's a brand new capability, is the URL where the export link points to is a new URL that you'll see under script.google.com/feeds, and that has an export endpoint where it'll essentially get the ID of the file followed by the format, and the only supported format is JSON. So if you're trying other formats, you'll get an error. And you'll use the same authorization header, the same OAuth credentials to get at this content. And the response you'll get back is a new type of JSON response. This one essentially is an array of files. And it's a pretty extensible format, and hopefully we'll keep pushing the capabilities of this. But for now, it's a file object that is made up of 4 things. The ID, the internal identifier of this file. This is the file within the project. The type of file, whether it's a JavaScript file or an HTML file. The name of the file, code.js or code.gs or index.html. And then really the most important part, which is the actual source code. So we encode this to make it friendly with JSON, and we'll describe some of the details of how the client libraries take care of parsing that. But if you are hand parsing these things, just make sure you're accounting for the JSON-friendly encoding that we do. Right. And you can actually eyeball this, and you can see what it's doing, right? So you can see that there's the do-get, there's the quotes, and then here's the HTML. We encode it again. So actually, kind of pretty easy to look at this, and we actually describe what they are as well down here. The only 2 types you'll see today are server.js and HTML, and this will mimic what you can do from here, right? Okay. So that's how I was able to get the file. As far as sending it back up, now this has some of its own nuances. We do what's called an HTTP put request. and that's updating something in place. And the important thing here is to specify the type of content you're putting, HTTP header of content type. And this is an important thing to remember if you're handwriting this. So the fact that it is a VND, Google Apps script, plus JSON. The plus is sort of a normal way we describe the alternative type we're uploading that. Because we're not actually uploading this, we're uploading this in the format of JSON, right? That's what that signifies. And again, this will look like what you downloaded. Now, there are a lot of things that probably comes to mind. You're probably asking, okay, how do I delete a file within a project? How do I rename them? How do I create a new one? And it's all based on state. Well, not state, it's based on IDs, I should say. If you send us a file without an ID, it'll get or an ID that we don't know. That means create a new file. So we'll just assume that you want a new file created.
Makes a lot of sense.
If you don't send us a file that we have on the server side, that means you don't want that file retained, as in delete.
So that means that if you have a multi-file project, you got to send back every file every time, not just the file you just updated right now.
That's right.
Otherwise,
That's
you're
right.
going to
So
delete
if you should take advantage of the gzip compression that the API offers, but it does mean that there is a bunch of data that's going back and forth at this point. So yeah, be careful. Make sure that you're sending back up the whole thing rather than just what you changed. The patch semantics are not available at this point. And renaming, as you can imagine, if you keep the ID the same and change the name, we know that it's the same file, you're just calling it something different.
And if I try to keep the same ID but change it from a server.js file to an HTML file, is that going to work?
No, doesn't work. I would have expected that to work as well, so I tried it out, but the UI doesn't support it, so you cannot convert a file here, so you can't change this. So a lot of ways it kind of mimics what the UI provides.
Makes a lot of
so
sense.
just kind of keep that in mind. The API is not as foolproof as the UI, for instance. You could, if we block you from deleting the last file, the API does give you error messages, so you'll have to kind of look at it and make sure that you're doing the appropriate things. The UI is much more friendlier towards mistakes and guides you to the right thing.
Yeah.
All right, and then the last thing is creating a new project from scratch. So we didn't show you this in the example. This is a bit more advanced. This is you want to have a new file in your drive created without the user taking any action at all as the user. And for this, you'd use what's called a post request. And again, it's the same URL without any ID. So there's no file ID in this case because you're creating a brand new one. The important thing here is this convert equal to true parameter. So that is by default off in the API. Since you're sending up a JSON and converting it to an app script app, you do need to send that in. And the post parameters, the post body will look just like the other body that you've seen in the
Except you're not sending IDs for the files.
That's
either,
right. That's
because
right.
They're all brand new creations.
That's right. Exactly. So, and this will create a project called Untitled in your drive. So there are ways where you can include metadata in the creation part itself. And for that, we really recommend using the client libraries because that's actually two requests, one for the metadata and one for the media. So just kind of keep that in mind.
Or just write an app script to find any new untitled projects and give them new names.
Yeah, that's another way to solve that problem. Leave it to Dan.
Yeah.
All right, so now let's take a look at how we did this in the Python example. Zoom out a little bit. So again, this is something that we'll clean up and share with you. But let's take a look at the download part. Here's what we're doing. We're fetching drive_service is the wrapper that we get from the client library. And we're very easily able to say get me all the files where this project, this ID matches. So it's really straightforward if you use the client libraries. You don't have to, in fact, none of the code here will actually do any REST calls itself. We're just using the Python client libraries and say execute on it. And then once I get the response back, I can just say, give me the export links, and then particularly give me the application/JSON link. Excuse me. And then you're able to very quickly get the download URL and then go ahead and get that as well. So now I have my content of the project. What we're doing next is creating a folder. If it doesn't exist, then we're iterating and deleting any files in the folder if it's already there, so that new files can get copied over. Again, you might have a lot of different optimization options here. We're storing the manifest, and I'll come back to this because it's required for the upload. And then I'm just iterating through all the files that we get back, and then we're just creating the file with the appropriate extension, .js or .html. Your rules apply here as well. The very last thing that we do is make sure we write the source code into it with the right, ultimately do that. And since we're using the client libraries and Python's JSON parsing capabilities, it takes care of all the encoding, decoding stuff, right? So I get this nice look here rather than this kind of one-line representation of that, which is great. And then the last part I'll show is the upload part. What we're doing here is we're actually opening up the manifest. And the manifest is important because I'm not storing the file IDs anywhere else. So I was thinking about different ways to solve this. Potentially I could have hidden it in the first line of the file itself, or I could name the file its ID, or something along those lines. But it's a lot easier to just have a manifest file for the demo. And again, this is where I feel like the developers that are going to be building apps will really shine and do something pretty cool and creative. And what I'm doing here is I'm just iterating through the manifest and copying back into the manifest the source code to send back up. I'm storing it temporarily, and then using the media file upload capability from the client library, giving it the file to upload. What I'm also doing is including a sort of the metadata about it, like the MIME type and things like that. And here's where I could potentially rename the project as well, which is really nice capability. And then ultimately, just a single call to say files.update for this particular project, and then here's the body and here's the media. Really straightforward. We're talking about 100-odd lines of code in Python, which is a pretty succinct language to begin with. But even in Java or PHP, you'll find yourself doing this in a lot less lines of code than you'd expect. And this is just a very simple synchronization utility for a particular folder in a project. But we think that there's going to be some really useful stuff that people will end up building with this.
It's going to be a race to see who can come up with the best implementation.
Yeah. I think we're at time. We're really excited to see what you can build with this. Find us on Stack Overflow. Find us on Google+. Tell us what you're going to be building, what you've tried, and any issues you have. Feel free to log it in the issue tracker. We do ask you to kind of figure out whether it's a drive issue or an AppScript issue. And you can do that using all the tools I described. The APIs Explorer is a really good tool. That'll really make sure that you get the right response from the right people rather than having to have us triage it. But I think with this video and hopefully this documentation page, which we'll keep updating and adding more content and samples to, I think that was all we wanted to talk about.
Yeah, that looks really good.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Excited to see what you guys do. AppScript forever.